Rachel was born 23rd of November in Tooting, London. A former model, she fell pregnant with her son Alex while studying for an English and History degree and made the decision to become a full-time mum. On July 15, 1992, when Alex was 2 years old, his mother was violently attacked, sexually assaulted and murdered whilst they were walking in Wimbledon Common with their dog Molly. Rachel was only 23 years old when she was murdered, and little Alex was the only person to witness the horrific crime. The original investigation was full of problems and eventually collapsed with no suspect or evidence linking anyone to the murder of Rachel, leaving the family without answers. It was a breach of justice as an innocent man was arrested for the crime, and also because police used a honey trap, which is deploying a female officer to enter a form of relationship with a suspect to get them to confide or confess. The man they targeted was Colin Stagg, whose photograph resembled the original photo fit the police had generated during the initial investigation. In 1994, the case went to trial and was subsequently dropped, as not only was there no evidence pointing to Colin as the perpetrator, but there was no evidence to point to any suspect at all. Any suspects went undetected for over a decade, until 2002 when the police decided to reopen the case and involved Dr. Angela Gallop, a serious forensic scientist who had worked on some of the most high-profile cases in the UK. She created a team of forensic investigators, DNA profilers and forensic chemists to take another look at the evidence in order to identify the person responsible for such a heinous crime. They started by looking at the taping evidence that was collected from Rachel's body. Taping is a test that uses adhesive tape applied to the skin to collect small samples that may be present on a body. After analysing the previous results taken, Dr. Gallop's team found that there was no DNA profile from the attacker, but even more strange, there was no DNA from Rachel, even though the samples had been taken from intimate areas on Rachel's body, which should have provided a prolific amount of her DNA. So what went wrong with the taping samples, and had police missed an opportunity to catch the killer? After further investigation, and due to the lack of Rachel's own DNA found in the samples, it told the forensic team that something was wrong with the method they had used to analyse the sample. The test was carried out using the best option available at the time, and is known as low copy number or LCN, and recent cases have revealed that LCN has limitations. This includes the risk of false positives and negatives in DNA analysis, and also due to the small amounts of DNA used in an LCN sample, it can lead to the incorrect identification of a suspect, or failure to identify a suspect at all. It was determined that the DNA sample had been swamped, resulting in no DNA profiles being able to be identified. The forensics team abandoned the LCN tests and, using standard techniques, were able to identify 2 DNA profiles from the tapings. There was a large amount of DNA from Rachel, but they also found another profile, potentially from a male, but there was not enough in the sample to confirm. They were also running out of samples and had only generated a partial DNA profile from the tapings, so they turned to the clothes Rachel was wearing to look for any trace evidence, including fibres and hairs, and also any blood distribution that fell outside the blood patterns of the initial attack. The first search was unsuccessful, so the team decided to run an experiment and look at where an attacker was most likely to touch their victim to remove their clothing. They focused on the waistband and button of her jeans, but were unable to identify any DNA that was separate to Rachel's. In a final attempt, forensic experts went back to the taping samples and looked at ways to try and purify and concentrate the remaining DNA. It took them 2 years to develop a technique they were confident with, and one that is now routinely used, called DNA enhancement, which is a method that increases the amount of DNA available for testing. There was a minute amount of DNA evidence left, so the scientists knew how important it was to get it right. They performed DNA enhancement on the tapings, which again revealed a mixed profile, Rachel's DNA and an unidentified male, but they now had enough DNA to make comparisons to people of interest, and when they ran the sample, it matched to one individual. His name was Robert Napper, and he was already in the database for violent and sexual offences. In 1989, 3 years before the murder of Rachel Nickell, there was a horrific attack on a young woman living in Plumstead Common. The perpetrator had entered the house through the back garden, gone upstairs to the bedroom, and raped her whilst her children were having breakfast downstairs in the kitchen. DNA samples were retrieved from the crime scene, but there was no match on the system. However, Napper must have felt some remorse, as he confessed to his mother what he had done, and she reported the incident to police. Unfortunately, a record wasn't found for the crime, so he wasn't charged. This was a missed opportunity for police to catch Napper after the first incident, but sadly this wasn't the case. Napper's mental state deteriorated and was regularly attacking women, leading to a spate of assaults that branded him the green chain rapist. There were several attacks between 1989 and 1992, prompting police to put together a crime squad to catch the assailant, not knowing they had already spoken to him and let him go. In 1993, police attended a gruesome crime scene where Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter had been murdered. The scene was something the detective had never experienced, with Samantha's body cut open and her internal organs stabbed multiple times. They found the body of her daughter in an upstairs bedroom and determined that she had also been sexually assaulted before being murdered. Police ruled out any connection between the murder of Rachel to the brutal attack on Samantha and her daughter, as they already had Stagg in custody and awaiting trial. However, there were similarities that can't be ignored, that the victim was a young woman who was with their child, a somewhat unusual motive for an attacker to follow. The assailant had left no clues at the scene apart from fingerprints that were found on the balcony, in the flat, and in Samantha's daughter's cot. The fingerprints were reanalysed and they belonged to Napper. This put him at the scene, and on his arrest a sample of his DNA was taken, which matched to several other samples taken from victims of the green chain rapist. In 1995, Napper was convicted of the murder of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, along with attempted rape and other rape charges. He was sent to the notorious psychiatric facility Broadmoor, which housed infamous criminals and serial killers, but was Napper responsible for killing Rachel? Initial results seemed to suggest that Napper was, but the results were inconclusive as there was not a full DNA profile from the evidence collected from Rachel's body. The forensics team began to look for any other evidence to prove that Napper was the attacker. They knew that the DNA found on Rachel's body had come from a male, as it contained XY chromosomes, so they decided to target the Y chromosome to retrieve a full DNA profile, and it was an almost perfect match to prime suspect Robert Napper. The police had searched Napper's flat and found other items that pointed to guilt, including a number of offensive weapons, ropes and books on martial arts that were all kept in a red toolbox. Napper was very protective of this toolbox and always tried to keep it close by. The toolbox contained vital evidence pertaining to Rachel's young son Alex that helped to solve the murder. The toolbox was made with steel, covered with a thin layer of red paint. One of the forensic investigators recalled seeing red fragments in a hair sample that was taken from Alex whilst he was in the hospital. As Alex was the only eyewitness, it was important to investigate all evidence related to him. They compared the fragments found in the hair with the red paint on the toolbox and found that they were microscopically and chemically similar. The analysis showed that the fragments from Alex's hair were the same type of steel that the toolbox was made from, and the flecks of red paint also matched. This suggests that Napper kept the murder weapon in the toolbox, and when removing the weapon, flecks transferred onto his clothes and then onto Alex's head. This was enough to prove that Napper had been in the area that day and that he had murdered Rachel. The toolbox was not the only item brought in for analysis. There were shoe marks found in a muddied area around the crime scene, and Alex had said he'd seen a man washing his hands in a stream close to where Rachel's body was found. Casts were taken of the shoe marks and compared to a pair of dress shoes retrieved from Napper's flat. There was a small lattice pattern on the casts that looked similar to the pattern on the heel of Napper's shoe. However, the pattern from the cast was slightly smaller than the one from the shoe, and forensically, if there is a difference in variables such as size, then the team are unable to make a link. Forensics thought it was worth pursuing and wanted to determine why there was a difference in shoe size, even though the patterns matched. They created a reconstruction where a member of the forensics team wore a similar pair of shoes and walked the same path where the imprints were found. They determined that as a person withdraws their foot from a muddied area, it creates a partial vacuum, leaving the imprint slightly smaller than the actual shoe. This evidence puts Napper standing near Rachel and was the third piece of key evidence that could link him to the murder. After 10 years, there was finally enough evidence to connect Napa to the murder of 23-year-old Rachel. Fortunately for police, Napa pleaded guilty to the murder, and in December 2008, 16 years after the attack, Napa was charged with manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and ordered to never be released from Broadmoor. The case would never have been solved if it wasn't for the meticulous work of the forensics team led by Dr. Angela Gallop. And although it's changed his life forever, Alex has found the strength to forgive Napa and move forward with his life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more interesting case files, and let me know in the comments if there's any cases you would like to see on the channel. Thanks for watching and stay safe.